Welcome to Buried Truths, where the dust of time is swept away and history's deepest secrets rise to the surface. The seeds of the Cold War were sown during the 1917 Russian Revolution when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar and established a communist state. Western powers, including the United States and Britain, were alarmed by the rise of communism and even intervened militarily in the Russian Civil War to support anti-Bolshevik forces. This early conflict created deep mistrust between the Soviet Union and the West. The ideological clash between capitalism and communism would only grow stronger in the years that followed. During World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union became uneasy allies against Nazi Germany. Despite fighting a common enemy, tensions remained just beneath the surface. Stalin was frustrated over delays in opening a second front in Western Europe, while Roosevelt was suspicious of Soviet ambitions. In Eastern Europe, the alliance was built on necessity, not trust. Once the war ended, the differences that had been suppressed for survival began to erupt into open hostility. The 1945 Yalta Conference marked a turning point. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met to plan the post-war world. Although agreements were made on dividing Germany and holding free elections in Europe, the interpretations of these promises varied widely. Stalin intended to maintain control over Eastern Europe to create a buffer zone, while the West expected democratic governments to emerge. This misalignment created the foundation for future confrontations and the cementing of rival spheres of influence. The Potsdam Conference in July 1945 further exposed the cracks. With Roosevelt dead and Churchill replaced during the meeting, Stalin faced new leaders, President Truman and Prime Minister Attlee. Truman was more confrontational and skeptical of Stalin's intentions. The U.S. had successfully tested the atomic bomb during the conference and used that knowledge to pressure the Soviets. Stalin, however, was undeterred and accelerated Soviet control in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, Hungary, and Romania. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. This metaphor captured the growing division between Western democracies and Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union justified its occupation of Eastern Europe as a defense against future invasions, but the West saw it as aggressive expansion. Mutual suspicion intensified, and propaganda from both sides began painting the other as an existential threat to global peace and stability. The Truman Doctrine in 1947 formalized the U.S. policy of containment. President Harry Truman pledged support to countries resisting communism, beginning with aid to Greece and Turkey. This marked the beginning of America's global commitment to stopping Soviet influence. The Soviet Union interpreted this as a declaration of ideological war. From this point onward, the Cold War became not just a rivalry but a structured battle between two competing worldviews, liberal democracy and authoritarian socialism. By 1947, the Cold War had begun in earnest. Both superpowers began forming alliances, spying networks, and economic blocs. The Marshall Plan was launched to rebuild Western Europe, further alarming the Soviets, who viewed it as an attempt to buy influence. The world was now divided into two camps, each distrustful and prepared for conflict. Though no direct war had started, the ideological, political, and economic battles between the U.S. and USSR had been set in motion. By 1947, the world was clearly divided. The Iron Curtain separated the communist East from the capitalist West. The Soviet Union tightened its grip over Eastern Europe, setting up puppet governments in countries like East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. In response, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, providing $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe and prevent communism's spread. Stalin saw this as economic warfare. As a result, tensions escalated, and the Cold War moved from suspicion to active containment. The Berlin Crisis of 1948 became one of the first direct confrontations. The Allies had unified their zones in West Germany and introduced a new currency, angering the Soviets. Stalin retaliated by blocking all land access to West Berlin. In response, the U.S. and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, flying in food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year. Over 200,000 flights sustained the city. The blockade failed, and Stalin lifted it in 1949. But the damage to relations was irreversible. In 1949, two major developments shocked the West. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. Second, China fell to communism under Mao Zedong after a brutal civil war. These events heightened American fears of a global communist expansion. In response, the United States formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance of Western powers. The Soviets would soon create their own bloc, intensifying the arms race and deepening global polarization. NATO's formation in 1949 solidified military lines. 12 nations pledged mutual defense, warning the Soviet Union that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. Stalin viewed NATO as a direct threat. In 1950, the National Security Council Report 68, NSC 68, advised a massive increase in U.S. military spending to confront the Soviet threat. This policy laid the groundwork for the militarization of the Cold War. Both sides began building stockpiles and preparing for potential global conflict. In 1950, the Korean War erupted. Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded South Korea. The U.S., under the UN flag, quickly intervened to repel the invasion. After initial setbacks, American and South Korean forces pushed north, but Chinese intervention reversed gains. The war turned into a stalemate around the 38th parallel. It was a bloody and costly proxy war that ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty, cementing Korea's division. The Korean War had far-reaching effects. It validated the Truman Doctrine and convinced American leaders of the need to resist communism with military force, not just diplomacy. It also legitimized the U.S. policy of global containment. At home, the war intensified anti-communist sentiment. Senator Joseph McCarthy began his infamous hunt for communists in the deized U.S. government, leading to a climate of fear and paranoia. Internationally, alliances hardened and the Cold War became deeply rooted in political and military structures. By 1953, the Cold War had entered a new phase. Stalin's death that year created uncertainty, but the division of the world was now firm. Europe was split between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The U.S. and USSR had entered into an ideological and strategic deadlock. Armed with nuclear weapons, both sides understood that open war could mean mutual destruction. The stage was set for a prolonged global conflict fought through espionage, proxy wars, and constant political brinkmanship. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev took control of the Soviet Union, promising de-Stalinization and a softer approach. However, tensions with the West remained. In 1955, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact, a direct response to NATO. Meanwhile, Eisenhower led the U.S. with a strong anti-communist stance. The Cold War was now global. Both superpowers increased military spending and expanded their ideological influence. Espionage, propaganda, and proxy conflicts defined this period of heightened rivalry and mutual suspicion. In 1956, Hungary attempted to break free from Soviet control. Citizens protested, demanding democratic reforms and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. Initially, the Soviets hesitated, but later sent tanks into Budapest. Thousands were killed, and the uprising was crushed. The West condemned the brutality but did not intervene militarily. This showed Eastern Europe that the Soviet grip remained strong. The event exposed the limits of Western influence behind the Iron Curtain and revealed the violent lengths Moscow would go to retain control. The Suez Crisis of 1956 further complicated global alliances. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, angering Britain, France, and Israel. They launched a joint military intervention. The US and Soviet Union surprisingly opposed the invasion and pressured a withdrawal. This revealed a shift in global power. Traditional European powers were declining, and the Cold War superpowers dominated diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Soviets used the crisis to expand their ties in the Middle East, offering arms and aid to nations, opposing Western influence. In 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. This event stunned the United States and sparked the space race. Fearing Soviet technological superiority, America created NASA and increased investment in science and education. The Cold War had expanded into space, where superiority symbolized ideological dominance. Soviet prestige soared, but the U.S. responded rapidly. The race for space became a symbol of national pride and global influence, with both nations seeking to prove their system's supremacy. In 1960, the U-2 incident further strained relations. A U.S. spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet territory. Eisenhower initially denied its purpose, but the Soviets produced the captured pilot and plane wreckage. This embarrassment led to the collapse of a planned U.S.-Soviet summit. Khrushchev stormed out, and diplomatic relations deteriorated. The incident proved that despite public diplomacy, both sides relied heavily on espionage and distrusted one another deeply, further fueling Cold War hostilities. In 1961, John F. Kennedy became U.S. president. He quickly faced the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed CIA-backed mission to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. The operation embarrassed the U.S. and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. Later that year, the Berlin crisis erupted again. Khrushchev demanded Western withdrawal from West Berlin. When the West refused, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall to stop East Germans from fleeing. The wall became the ultimate Cold War symbol of division. Tensions peaked with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The U.S. discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy demanded their removal and ordered a naval blockade. After intense negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for U.S. pledges not to invade Cuba and to secretly remove missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully, but marked the closest point the Cold War came to turning hot. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers turned their focus toward indirect conflicts, proxy wars, across the globe. These wars became arenas for the U.S. and USSR to promote their ideologies without direct confrontation. The battlegrounds were Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where local disputes were transformed into Cold War confrontations. The goal was influence, not peace. Funding, arms, and advisors flowed from both sides into foreign territories. Proxy wars became a key Cold War strategy, allowing rivalry without nuclear catastrophe. Vietnam became the most prominent proxy war. After the French defeat in 1954, Vietnam was divided into a communist North and pro-Western South. The U.S. escalated its involvement in the 1960s to prevent a communist takeover. By 1965, hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed. The Soviets and China supported North Vietnam with weapons and supplies. Brutal guerrilla warfare, bombings, and high casualties defined the war. It deeply divided American society and symbolized the failure of U.S. containment policy. Africa also became a major Cold War theater. In Angola, after gaining independence from Portugal in 1975, civil war broke out between U.S.-backed UNITA and Soviet-Cuban-supported MPLA. Thousands of Cuban troops fought alongside Marxist forces. Similarly, in Ethiopia and Somalia, shifting alliances and arms supplies from the U.S. and USSR kept the region in constant turmoil. These interventions had devastating impacts on civilian populations. African nations often became pawns in the ideological battle, with development sacrificed for geopolitical interests. In Latin America, the Cold War played out through coups, revolutions, and covert operations. The U.S. backed right-wing regimes and military juntas to prevent leftist movements from rising. In Chile, the CIA supported the 1973 coup that overthrew socialist President Salvador Allende and brought dictator Pinochet to power. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution led to years of U.S. opposition and eventual funding of the Contras. These interventions aimed to halt the spread of socialism, but often caused repression and instability. The Middle East also saw intensified Cold War competition. After the 1967 Six-Day War, Soviet support grew for Arab nations like Egypt and Syria, while the U.S. backed Israel with arms and aid. The 1973 Yom Kippur War saw near-direct confrontation as both superpowers supplied their allies heavily. The oil embargo that followed, imposed by OPEC, showed the Cold War's economic impact. Control over resources and alliances in the region became crucial as oil became a central strategic asset. The Indian subcontinent experienced Cold War dynamics too. In 1971, India and Pakistan went to war, resulting in the creation of Bangladesh. India received strong Soviet backing, while Pakistan aligned with the U.S. and China. The USSR and India signed a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation, cementing their strategic ties. Meanwhile, American support for Pakistan was driven by its geopolitical utility against Soviet-aligned India. South Asia had become another front in the Cold War, reflecting the global scope of the rivalry. Despite the violence, the period also saw attempts at diplomacy. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1968, aimed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. Superpower summits and arms control agreements like SALT I in 1972 sought to reduce direct conflict. Yet behind these efforts, proxy wars raged. The Cold War had seeped into every continent, every political upheaval, and every regional crisis. Peace seemed elusive. The ideological conflict had moved beyond Europe, reshaping the world in its image by 1979. The Cold War entered a volatile phase in 1979 with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It marked the end of détente and reignited tensions between the superpowers. The U.S. viewed the invasion as Soviet expansionism and reacted strongly. President Carter condemned the act, imposing economic sanctions and boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The CIA began covertly funding Afghan Mujahideen fighters to resist the Soviets. Afghanistan became the USSR's Vietnam, draining resources and morale. The invasion symbolized a breakdown in diplomacy and trust. In the West, the Soviet move triggered a wave of fear and hardline policy shifts. NATO increased military spending, and the U.S. reinstated aggressive rhetoric. The Carter Doctrine warned that any attempt to control the Persian Gulf would be met with force. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, he adopted an even tougher stance. Calling the USSR an evil empire, Reagan escalated military buildup, including the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a missile shield. The arms race intensified like never before. The Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, aimed to use space-based systems to intercept Soviet missiles. Though criticized as unrealistic and expensive, it symbolized a new frontier in Cold War rivalry. The USSR saw it as a threat to the balance of power. Meanwhile, both nations deployed new intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe. Anti-nuclear protests erupted across the continent. Public fear of nuclear war surged. For many, the early 1980s marked the most dangerous phase since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tensions also spiked over events in Poland. In 1980, the Solidarity Trade Union, led by Lech Wałęsa, challenged the communist regime. The movement gained massive support, alarming Moscow. In 1981, martial law was imposed to crush the movement. The U.S. responded with sanctions on Poland and the USSR. Solidarity's resistance became a symbol of hope for Eastern Europe. Though suppressed, it showed cracks forming in the Soviet bloc. The crisis in Poland highlighted the limits of Soviet control over satellite states. In 1983, the Cold War nearly turned hot during the NATO exercise Able Archer. The Soviets feared the drill was a cover for a real nuclear strike. They placed forces on high alert and tensions reached an alarming peak. A Soviet colonel, Stanislav Petrov, famously refused to launch retaliatory missiles after a false radar alert, possibly preventing World War III. The incident underscored how miscommunication and fear could lead to disaster. It revealed how fragile global peace had become during this era. Meanwhile, in the Third World, Cold War confrontations continued. In Central America, the U.S. funded Contra rebels against the leftist Sandinistas in Nicaragua. In Grenada, American forces invaded in 1983 to oust a Marxist regime, claiming to protect American citizens. The USSR condemned these actions as imperialist aggression. Proxy wars raged on in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. These conflicts drained resources and stoked hostility. For both powers, the ideological contest remained global, fought with weapons, money, and influence rather than diplomacy. Despite escalating tension, signs of fatigue were emerging. The Soviet economy stagnated under Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko. Military overspending strained resources, and technological gaps widened. In the U.S., public concern over nuclear war grew. Movements for peace and arms control gained momentum. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, signaling change. The world stood at a turning point. Though the Cold War still raged, the crisis. Years revealed the unsustainable cost of confrontation. A new phase was about to begin. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, signaling a new direction. Recognizing the USSR's economic decline and political stagnation, he introduced two major reforms: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. These aimed to revive the Soviet economy and encourage transparency. Gorbachev reduced censorship, released political prisoners, and allowed limited market reforms. The West responded positively. U.S. President Ronald Reagan shifted from confrontation to dialogue. A thaw began. Gorbachev's leadership marked a clear break from past Soviet hardliners. Arms control talks resumed with new urgency. The 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty was a major breakthrough. It eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles from Europe. Reagan and Gorbachev met at several summits, improving relations. Trust began to replace suspicion. Gorbachev also began withdrawing Soviet troops from Afghanistan in 1988, ending a costly decade-long war. The West praised these moves, while Soviet conservatives grew alarmed. Internally, Gorbachev faced resistance from party hardliners who viewed his reforms as dangerous. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe stirred with unrest. Inspired by Gorbachev's reforms, people across the Eastern Bloc began demanding freedom. In 1989, solidarity triumphed in Poland's elections. Peaceful protests spread to Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The Iron Curtain was crumbling. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, symbol of Cold War division, fell after massive public demonstrations. Crowds dismantled it with hammers, as soldiers stood by. The event symbolized the collapse of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. The Cold War's foundations were cracking. One by one, communist regimes in Eastern Europe fell. Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania all saw revolutions or regime changes. The Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, chose not to intervene militarily. This non-interference marked a historic shift. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution peacefully ended communist rule. By 1990, most Eastern European nations had embraced democracy. Former satellite states realigned with the West, NATO, and the European. Community extended diplomatic recognition. Gorbachev's decision not to use force changed history and avoided bloodshed. In 1990, Germany reunified after decades of division. East and West Germany became one nation, with Berlin as its capital. Western leaders worked with Gorbachev to ensure a peaceful transition. The symbolic unification represented not only German healing, but the decline of Soviet influence. Around the same time, Gorbachev received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. But at home, he faced rising nationalism and economic turmoil. His reforms unleashed forces beyond his control, weakening central authority across the USSR. By 1991, the Soviet Union was unraveling. Republics like Lithuania, Ukraine, and Georgia declared independence. A failed coup by communist hardliners in August 1991 aimed to restore old control but collapsed after massive protests in Moscow. Russian President Boris Yeltsin emerged as a key leader. Gorbachev's power faded rapidly. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned and declared the Soviet Union dissolved. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time. The Cold War was officially over. The end of the Cold War reshaped global politics. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, while Russia faced a difficult transition. Former Soviet republics gained independence but struggled with instability. NATO expanded eastward, while Eastern Europe embraced democracy and capitalism. The ideological battle that had dominated the 20th century was over. Yet the legacy of the Cold War remained, in nuclear arsenals, global alliances, and regional tensions. Though the war ended without direct conflict, its shadows lingered for decades. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far, and stay tuned, because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.